Sometime after Henry V's forces have invaded France, the scene shifts to Catherine and Alice. Catherine being a French princess, Alice being the woman who attends Catherine. And it shifts to French. Those of us who have not had a chance to study French are at a little bit of a disadvantage because, of course, these days texts will give us the English translation, but something is lost here if we're not able to read this section of the play in French. But what this brings to mind is that one of the consequences of conflicts, one of the consequences of war, is language development. And the language we're communicating in right now, modern English, is the product of all sorts of evolution, all sorts of change, all sorts of interaction between different peoples from different cultures over time. And some of that interaction has involved war. And the language we're communicating in now, whatever else it is, it's it's sort of a living memento of wars that have been fought, of conquests that have been brought about, which have led to linguistic change. And let's look at this passage here. So native French speakers will hate my accent, but Alice, tu as été en Angleterre. Alice, Catherine says, you've been in England, et tu parles bien le langage, and you speak the language well. Alice says, un peu, madame, a little bit, right? And Catherine says, je te prie, m'enseigner. So I ask you to teach me. Il faut que j'apprenne. So I need to learn à parler. Il faut que j'apprenne à parler. I need to learn to speak. Now, why does Catherine need to learn to speak? Well, because the English have come. The English are in the process of conquering. I think we get some insight here, and Shakespeare puts into Catherine's words the assumption that the English are going to win. And if the English win, then if the English conquer, right, then that means we'd better learn English, right? And this kind of makes the point. Catherine's thinking, well, here come the English. In other words, here comes cultural change. I should prepare and begin to learn English. Comment appelez-vous la main en anglais? What do you call the hand in English? And Alice says, la main, the hand. Elle est appelée de hand, right? And so anyway, you go through this, and Catherine wants to know what the fingers are called and other parts of the body, etc. Now what's interesting is that if we haven't studied French, this all might look quite foreign, which obviously it is. It's a different language. But as you get into French, as you get into Spanish, as you get into other languages, you begin to notice a lot of similarities. For example, you notice in that first line the word bien, right? Bien, good. And we have the word benefit, bien, benefit. And both of those words can be traced back to Latin, right? Notice the word langage, very close to our word language. Also, both of which are traced back to Latin. Notice that Catherine says, je te prie. And that prie there, that's like our word pray, which, of course, in a religious sense, to pray, but you can also say, pray, tell me where is McDonald's, right? In other words, to pray is to ask a question, or I ask you, or I ask you to do something for me, je te prie. So prie, pray, very similar words, right? They have the same history. They just work themselves out a little bit differently in French. And in English, il faut que j'apprenne. I need to learn that apprenne. In English, we have the word apprentice, somebody who learns, apprenne, apprentice. We can see the similarities there. And then la main, the hand. In Spanish, la mano, right? Well, in English, we have the word manual, as in manual labor, which means labor done with the hand. And so, French and English have a lot more in common than we originally think. And one of the reasons for that is that the French actually, back in 1096, invaded England. And the dominant language, when we think of the language of government of England, changed dramatically. A lot of French got into English, which helps to explain a lot of the Latin which is in English. And so the language we're communicating in now, it has a lot of Latin in it. It has a lot of Greek in it. The Romans took over in the ancient world. The Romans kind of take over where the Greeks leave off in terms of their empire. A lot of Greek words get into Latin. Latin is obviously the dominant language of Western Europe. French is a dialect of Latin. When the French conquer England, they bring their Latin language with them. A lot of Latin gets into English as a result of different conquests. Latin, its dialect, the Latin dialect French, takes over that part of Western Europe because of the conquest of the Romans. The Romans themselves conquered present-day England. The French in 1096 will invade and conquer England. And so we have a lot of linguistic mixing. And the language we're communicating in now has a lot of Greek in it, has a lot of Latin in it, has a lot of Arabic in it, many, many Arabic words, has many Norse words, that is Norse from the Vikings. It has words from many other languages, and a good number of these words come into English as the result of war, as the result of conquest. Remember Catherine's point. Her assumption seems to be the English are going to win. They're in France now, they're going to win. Il faut que j'apprenne à parler English. It's necessary that I learn to speak English, right? It points us to how one of the consequences of war, sometimes anyway, is linguistic change. I mentioned to you that the Romans invaded, the Romans built their empire, and so we can see that, for example, the Romans are there in Portugal and Spain. Portuguese and Spanish are basically dialects of Latin. We can see what's called there Gallia, I think it is, Gaul, as it will sometimes be called, roughly present-day France. Well, that also was conquered by the Romans, and so that Latin language, that French, that dialect of Latin called French becomes the dominant language there. The Romans invade Britannia, England, Wales, Cornwall, and the native languages there are changed somewhat by the Latin. Later, the French in the Middle Ages, 1066, will invade England again, and they'll bring a lot more Latin with them in the form of this Latin dialect, French. Here we have a map that shows us some of the invasions. You see on the bottom there in the orange, the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Norman referring to, or from that region of Normandy, across the English Channel from England. And English is changed significantly as a result of this invasion. A lot of French gets into English, a lot of Latin gets into English. We notice the other invasions. Look up at the top in the blue, Vikings. The Vikings invade England earlier in the Middle Ages. They invade not only England, but present-day Scotland, Ireland, etc. And there are a lot of words that we use all of the time that come to us from the Vikings, that come to us from the Norse. The word club, for example, knife, shirt, sky, slaughter. There are many words that come into English from the Vikings, and there's an example of how conquest leads to language change. The Jutes, the Angles, the Saxons, they invade present-day England, and they bring their Germanic languages with them. Notice the Angles and the Saxons there. We're looking at northern Germany there, present-day Denmark, right? They're not indigenous to England. That is, they're from somewhere else. They invade England, but then we refer to, or we see that English is a Germanic language. So you have other languages spoken in England, present-day England, languages spoken in present-day Britain, that are displaced by the languages of the Angles, by the languages of the Saxons, and then changed to a degree by the language of the Vikings, and then changed significantly by the language of the Normans. And the language we're communicating in now is sort of the living record of this tremendous historical change, much of it brought about by conflict. we're not going to go into detail here, but if you look at the very top, this is the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, etc., in 4 languages here. All right, and up at the top is a Celtic language, and Celtic languages dominate in Britain before the Angles and the Saxons, before the Vikings, before the Normans, right? And we still have Celtic languages that are spoken in Britain. Welsh is the strongest among them, and that Welsh version of the Lord's Prayer up there is pretty foreign, except you'll notice the word I have there in white, sancteidir, right? So let's look at that first line, Ein Tad, that is our Father, Urhun Ananafoith, who is in heaven, sancteidir de enu. Welsh speakers will be horrified by my accent. But I want you to, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Hallowed, sancteidir. So notice sancteidir, and then go down to the third one, the anglo-norman one, right? This would be a language spoken, say in London, let's say in the year 1100, right? And notice that the word in white there in that first line in the anglo-norman version, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, sanctifié, right? Sanctifié. Look again, sancteidir, and you see how the beginnings are very similar, right? So I don't know how that Latin-influenced word got into the Welsh. Perhaps when the Romans invaded, perhaps more likely when the Normans invaded later in the Middle Ages. But even in that Welsh version, we see something that clearly comes to us ultimately from the Romans, because that word sancteidir would be related to, for example, the Latin word sanctus, holy, right? The next one we have is Anglo-Saxon, and that's German, and we're not going to go into it here. Let's just point out Father ur thuthiarton hiavonum, that very first line, Father ur, our Father. Father ur, our Father, sounds very familiar, right? And so that's kind of English, right? That's the English language. What we're speaking now is that plus Latin, plus French, plus Arabic, plus ancient Greek that gets into English, plus words from many other languages. If you look at the Anglo-Norman again, you see sanctifié. That's similar to sancteidir up in the Welsh, right? But then look down toward the bottom, and I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but notice I'll just say tempte and tempteon down at the bottom of the Anglo-Norman. And then if you look in the Middle English, now this would be from the latter 1400s, notice in that next to last line, temptation. And notice the similarity between temptation, if that's the right pronunciation, and temptation in Anglo-Norman. There we can see some of the French influence in English, right? Up in the Anglo-Saxon, temptation is kosnunga, right? Kosnunga is gone, doesn't exist any longer in English, not that I know of. But temptation, right? It sounds a lot like the Spanish, tentación, temptation. We can see how that French in the Anglo-Norman gets into English. Also, look at the very last line in the Anglo-Norman. Again, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but delivre-nos, right? Delivre-nos, that deliver part. And then look down on the bottom left there in Middle English, and you see something that looks very much like deliver. So even here we see, in small but noticeable ways, linguistic influence, right? Linguistic influence as the result of conquest, linguistic influence as the result of invasion, linguistic influence as a result of war. Linguistic influence takes place for a lot of reasons, trade, for example, but certainly war, conquest brings about linguistic change. If you look at the top there, history of the English language, so we have Celtic languages spoken in Britain, like the ancestor of present-day Welsh, for example. Latin comes in with the Romans. Then here come the Anglo-Saxons bringing their Germanic language, and English is a Germanic language, right? Then we have the Old Norse coming, those Vikings bringing their Viking vocabulary with them. Club, knife, berserk, for example, a lot of words in English sky, skirt, shirt, coming to us from the Vikings. Then we have Anglo-Norman, that French language that comes with the Norman invasion of England in 1066. And then, you know, you've got other words that just make their way into English from, as more people in the Renaissance, for example, are reading Latin. Latin words will get into English. Greek, language exchange, pulling Spanish words into English, for example. And then we have Arabic words that will get into English. The world of Islam conquered, within the world of Islam, within the empire of the world of Islam, Spain, most of Spain, and Portugal, that part of Western Europe, actually was dominated and governed by, conquered by the world of Islam. And a good number of Arabic words got into Spanish, and then from there into English. So, for example, the English word coffee ultimately comes from Arabic. The word giraffe ultimately comes from Arabic. The word sugar from Arabic. The word cotton from Arabic. Other words like sofa, candy. There are many words that come into English from Arabic, and a good number of those came in through Spanish. So from Arabic into Spanish, partly because Spain was conquered by Islam, and Arabic words then get into the language of Spain, get into the language of Portugal, and then from Spain those words make their way into English. And so we see Catherine, who seems to assume that the English are going to win. She says, you know, il faut que j'apprenne English. It's necessary that I learn English because here come the English. And that reminds us that among the many things that lead to language change, that lead to linguistic evolution, there's no question about it, that conquest, that war, is a major contributor to linguistic change.